The golden elevators of Trump Tower carried whispers of panic that October morning in 2024. Donald Trump sat behind his mahogany desk, scrolling through his phone when an aide burst through the door with urgent news. A young military leader from West Africa was making headlines that could shake the very foundations of global finance. Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old president of Burkina Faso, had just announced something that made seasoned economists in Washington and Wall Street nervous. The former geology professor turned revolutionary leader was proposing an Afro money plan that could potentially free dozens of African nations from their dependence on Western currencies and financial systems. Trump's initial reaction was dismissive. He had seen countless African leaders make bold promises before, only to watch them fade into obscurity. But as his economic advisors began flooding his phone with calls and messages, the gravity of the situation became clear. This was not just another political statement from a small African nation. This was a calculated move that could reshape global economics. The plan was simple, yet revolutionary. Traoré proposed creating a unified African currency backed by the continent's vast gold reserves, diamond mines, and oil deposits. Unlike previous attempts at African monetary union, this plan had something different: the backing of several major African economies and the support of nations tired of Western financial control. Trump's team quickly arranged a conference call with his top economic advisors. The mood in the room was tense as they explained how Traoré's plan could work. Africa holds about 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including significant portions of gold, diamonds, platinum, and rare earth metals essential for modern technology. If African nations could successfully create their own currency system, it would reduce their need for US dollars and potentially weaken America's global financial influence. The young Burkinabe leader had already demonstrated his ability to surprise the world. Since taking power through a military coup in 2022, Traoré had expelled French forces from his country, reduced Western mining concessions, and formed new partnerships with Russia and China. His anti-Western rhetoric resonated with many Africans who felt exploited by former colonial powers and international financial institutions. What made Trump particularly uncomfortable was Traoré's growing popularity across Africa. The young leader had become a symbol of African independence and sovereignty. His speeches were viewed by millions online, and his calls for African unity were gaining traction among youth across the continent. Social media platforms were filled with supportive messages using hashtags like #AfroMoney and #African Independence. The economic implications were staggering. If successful, the Afro money plan could create a trading bloc of over 1 billion people with access to vast natural resources. This could potentially reduce global demand for US dollars, affect American trade relationships, and challenge the dominance of Western financial institutions in Africa. Trump's advisors painted a concerning picture. African nations currently hold hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign reserves, mostly in US dollars and European currencies. If these nations began converting their reserves to support a new African currency, it could create significant pressure on global currency markets. The psychological impact alone could encourage other regions to consider similar moves. The former president found himself in an unusual position, genuinely concerned about a development he had not anticipated. His usual confidence wavered as he realized that Traoré represented something new in African politics. Unlike previous leaders who often sought Western approval and support, this young revolutionary seemed genuinely committed to breaking away from Western influence entirely. Intelligence. Reports reaching Trump's desk painted Traoré as a serious threat to Western interests in Africa. The Burkinabe leader had successfully rallied other military governments in Mali, Niger, and Guinea around his vision of African independence. Together, these nations controlled significant portions of Africa's gold production and had already begun discussions about reducing their use of Western currencies in regional trade. What troubled Trump most was the timing. The announcement came at a moment when global confidence in the US dollar was already facing challenges due to inflation, government debt, and international tensions. China and Russia had been promoting alternatives to dollar-dominated trade for years, And now an African leader was proposing a solution that could accelerate this trend. The media response was immediate and intense. Financial news networks began analyzing the potential impact of an African currency union, while political commentators debated whether Traoré's plan was realistic or just political theater. International investors started paying closer attention to African markets, and some began hedging their positions in case the plan gained momentum. Trump's team worked frantically to understand the full scope of Traoré's proposal. They discovered that preliminary discussions had been ongoing for months between several African nations. Economic experts from various African countries had been quietly meeting to discuss technical details, suggesting this was not an impulsive announcement, but a carefully planned initiative. The plan's details were impressive in their scope. The proposed African currency would be backed by a combination of gold reserves, natural resources, and regional trade commitments. African nations would gradually reduce their dependence on foreign currencies for continental trade, starting with raw materials and gradually expanding to manufactured goods and services. As the day progressed, Trump's concern deepened. Phone calls from worried donors and business partners flooded in, all asking the same question. How seriously should they take this African currency plan? The uncertainty was palpable, and Trump realized he was facing something he had not encountered before in his political career. The young African leader had managed to capture global attention with a single announcement, forcing world leaders and financial experts to take African economic independence seriously. For the first time in years, Trump found himself without a quick comeback or dismissive tweet. The implications of Traoré's Afro money plan were too significant to ignore, and the potential consequences too serious to mock. As evening approached, Trump sat quietly in his office, staring out at the New York skyline. The city that never sleeps seemed different somehow, as if the announcement from a small West African nation had shifted something fundamental in the global order. The man, who prided himself on never being caught off guard, was experiencing exactly that, a moment of genuine uncertainty about what would come next. The morning after Ibrahim Traoré's announcement, Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate buzzed with unprecedented activity. Private jets landed continuously at Palm Beach International Airport, carrying some of America's most powerful business leaders and former government officials. Word had spread through exclusive networks that the former president was convening an emergency meeting about the African currency crisis. Trump had barely slept. Throughout the night, he received updates from contacts across the globe. The initial market reactions were mixed but telling. Gold prices had jumped 3% in overnight trading, while the dollar showed signs of nervousness in early Asian markets. More concerning were reports from his business associates in Africa, who confirmed that Traoré's announcement was being taken seriously by other African leaders. The conference room at Mar-a-Lago filled with familiar faces from Trump's previous administration and key figures from the financial world. Former Treasury officials, investment bank executives, and international trade experts gathered around the polished table, all sharing the same concern. They had underestimated the potential impact of African economic independence. What emerged from intelligence briefings was startling. Traoré had not simply made an impulsive announcement. The young leader had been building support for his Afro money plan for over 18 months, conducting quiet diplomatic missions across Africa and securing preliminary agreements with key nations. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya had all expressed interest in exploring alternatives to Western-dominated financial systems. The numbers were sobering. Combined, African nations held approximately $400 billion in foreign currency reserves. Their annual trade volume exceeded $200 billion, most of which currently flowed through Western banking systems. If even half of this economic activity shifted to an African currency system, the global financial implications would be significant. Trump's former economic advisor painted a detailed picture of how Traoré's plan could work. The proposed African Development Bank would issue the new currency, initially backed by gold reserves from participating nations. South Africa alone possessed nearly 6,000 tons of gold reserves, while other African nations contributed substantial amounts of other precious metals and resources. The psychological warfare aspect particularly intrigued Trump. Traoré had skillfully positioned his plan as a liberation movement rather than merely an economic policy. His speeches resonated with African pride and frustration over centuries of economic exploitation. Videos of young Africans celebrating the announcement had gone viral on social media platforms, creating a momentum that traditional diplomatic pressure might struggle to contain. Intelligence reports revealed that Traoré had been studying successful economic independence movements from other regions. He had examined how China gradually reduced its dependence on Western financial systems, how Russia developed alternative payment systems after sanctions, and how various Asian nations had created regional trading arrangements. The African leader was applying these lessons systematically. What made the situation more complex was Traoré's growing international support. Russia and China had publicly endorsed the concept of African monetary independence, offering technical assistance and alternative trading partnerships. This gave the young leader diplomatic cover and reduced African nations' fear of Western retaliation. Trump's business instincts told him this was more than political theater. The fundamentals were sound. Africa possessed the resources, the population, and increasingly, the political will to challenge Western financial dominance. The continent's youthful demographic, with over 60% of the population under 25, provided a natural constituency for change and independence movements. The meeting's tone grew increasingly serious as participants discussed potential American responses. Traditional diplomatic pressure seemed inadequate, given Traoré's demonstrated willingness to confront Western powers. Economic sanctions had already been tried against Burkina Faso with limited success, and broader sanctions against African nations could backfire by driving them further toward the new currency system. Private sector concerns dominated much of the discussion. American corporations operating in Africa worried about currency conversion costs, payment system disruptions, and potential restrictions on profit repatriation. Mining companies, oil corporations, and agricultural businesses all faced uncertainty about how their operations would be affected by African monetary independence. The technology sector presented another dimension of concern. Africa was rapidly expanding its digital infrastructure, and a new African currency could accelerate the adoption of blockchain-based payment systems that bypassed traditional Western banking. This could leapfrog decades of financial development and create systems that were inherently more difficult for Western institutions to influence or control. Trump found himself genuinely impressed by Traoré's strategic thinking. The young leader had identified a moment of global financial uncertainty and positioned himself as an alternative to Western dominance. The timing was particularly clever, coming as many nations questioned the stability of traditional reserve currencies and sought greater independence from Western political influence. Reports from African capitals painted a picture of genuine enthusiasm for the plan. Street celebrations had erupted in several cities, with young people expressing excitement about the possibility of African economic independence. University students organized rallies supporting the Afro money plan, while business leaders began exploring practical implementation strategies. The generational aspect was particularly striking. Older African leaders, who had spent decades navigating relationships with Western powers, showed more caution about Traoré's proposal. However, younger politicians and business leaders embraced the plan as an opportunity to finally break free from colonial-era economic structures that they viewed as fundamentally unfair. Intelligence agencies provided Trump with detailed profiles of key supporters across Africa. The list included influential governors, military leaders, business tycoons, and intellectual figures who had endorsed Traoré's vision. Many of these individuals had previously maintained pro-Western positions, suggesting that African sentiment was genuinely shifting toward greater independence. As the day progressed, Trump realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience. Never before had he encountered an African leader who combined genuine popular support, strategic thinking, access to significant resources, and the diplomatic skill to build international coalitions. Traoré represented a new kind of challenge, that traditional American approaches might not be equipped to handle. The evening news brought more concerning developments. Several African finance ministers had announced they would attend an emergency meeting in Ouagadougou to discuss practical steps toward implementing the Afro money plan. The African Union had scheduled a special session to address monetary independence, and preliminary technical committees had been established to study implementation challenges. By sunset, Trump sat alone on his Mar-a-Lago terrace, contemplating a situation unlike any he had faced in his business or political career. The young African revolutionary had managed to accomplish something remarkable. He had forced the world's most powerful nation to take African economic independence seriously. For perhaps the first time in his life, Trump found himself genuinely speechless about how to respond to an international challenge. 3 weeks after Traoré's announcement, the impossible was happening. Trump watched from his office as financial markets across the globe reacted to news that 12 African nations had formally committed to the Afro money plan. The young Burkinabe leader had done what seasoned diplomats thought impossible. He had united traditionally competitive African nations around a common economic vision. The commitment ceremony in Accra, Ghana, was unlike anything the international community had witnessed. Presidents, prime ministers, and finance ministers from across Africa stood together, signing agreements that would fundamentally reshape their continent's relationship with the global economy. Television cameras captured the historic moment, as Traoré, standing at the center of the group, held up the signed declaration with a smile that radiated confidence and determination. Trump's intelligence briefings painted a picture of meticulous planning that had caught Western observers completely off guard. While international attention focused on Traoré's public speeches, teams of African economists, central bankers, and legal experts had been quietly working on the technical framework for the new currency system. The level of detail and professional competence surprised even Trump's most experienced advisors. The proposed African gold standard represented a sophisticated approach to monetary independence. Unlike previous failed attempts at African monetary union, this plan addressed fundamental, technical challenges that had derailed earlier efforts. Each participating nation would contribute gold reserves proportional to their economic size and trade volume, creating a substantial backing for the new currency that would inspire international confidence. What truly concerned Trump was the plan's phased implementation strategy. Rather than attempting an immediate complete break from Western currencies, Traoré's team had designed a gradual transition over 5 years. This approach reduced risks and gave participating nations time to adjust their economic systems while building confidence in the new currency among both domestic populations and international partners. The first phase focused on regional trade between participating African nations. Starting with raw materials and agricultural products, these countries would begin conducting business using the new African currency, reducing their dependence on dollars and euros for continental commerce. This created immediate practical benefits, while building experience with the new system. International reaction varied dramatically across different regions. European leaders expressed diplomatic concern about the potential impact on their African trade relationships, while privately scrambling to understand how the new system might affect their access to African resources. The European Union convened emergency meetings to discuss potential responses, ranging from diplomatic pressure to alternative partnership offers. China and Russia provided a stark contrast to Western anxiety. Both nations publicly endorsed African monetary independence and offered technical assistance for implementing the new currency system. Chinese officials emphasized their respect for African sovereignty and their willingness to conduct trade using the new African currency once it became operational. Trump found himself in an unusual position of receiving detailed briefings about African economic capabilities that previous American administrations had largely ignored. The reports revealed a continent far more economically sophisticated than typical Western narratives suggested. African nations collectively possessed foreign reserves exceeding many developed countries, substantial gold reserves, rapidly growing technology sectors, and increasingly educated populations. The demographic trends were particularly striking. Africa's population was projected to double by 2050, creating the world's largest consumer market. The continent's median age of 19 years old meant that the generation embracing Traoré's independence message would dominate African politics and economics for decades to come. This gave the Afro money plan a natural constituency that traditional diplomatic pressure would struggle to influence. Private communications intercepted by intelligence services revealed the sophistication of planning behind the currency initiative. African central bankers had been collaborating for months on technical standards, exchange rate mechanisms, and regulatory frameworks. Their preparations addressed complex issues like inflation control, international trade settlement, and monetary policy coordination between sovereign nations. The technology component of the plan impressed even Trump's skeptical advisors. African nations were implementing blockchain-based payment systems that would make their new currency system more efficient and transparent than many existing Western alternatives. The digital infrastructure being developed could potentially leapfrog traditional banking systems and create competitive advantages in international trade. Business reaction in the United States was mixed, but increasingly concerned. Companies with significant African operations faced uncertainty about future currency conversion costs and payment systems. However, some American businesses saw opportunities in the changing landscape, particularly technology companies that could provide services for the new African financial infrastructure. Wall Street analysts began producing detailed reports about the potential impact of African monetary independence. While opinions varied about the likelihood of success, most agreed that even partial implementation could significantly affect global currency markets and international trade patterns. The psychological impact alone was already influencing investor behavior and currency exchange rates. Trump's political instincts told him this situation required a completely different approach than traditional American foreign policy toward Africa. Traoré was not seeking Western approval or assistance. He was actively working to reduce African dependence on Western systems. This made conventional diplomatic pressure potentially counterproductive and could accelerate African independence efforts. The young African leader's media strategy was particularly effective. Rather than engaging in diplomatic disputes with Western leaders, Traoré focused his communication on African audiences, emphasizing themes of dignity, independence, and economic sovereignty. His speeches were viewed by millions of young Africans who saw him as representing their aspirations for a more prosperous and independent future. Intelligence reports indicated that Traoré had studied American economic history, particularly the periods when the United States challenged British economic dominance. He frequently referenced how young nations had successfully developed independent economic systems despite initial skepticism from established powers. This historical perspective gave his arguments intellectual credibility and emotional resonance. The international banking sector was scrambling to understand the implications of the Afro money plan. Major banks with African operations faced potential disruption of their traditional business models, while simultaneously recognizing opportunities to provide services for the new currency system. Some institutions began quietly exploring partnerships with African financial institutions to position themselves for the changing landscape. As Trump reviewed the latest intelligence reports, he realized that underestimating Ibrahim Traoré had been a significant miscalculation. The young leader possessed a combination of vision, technical competence, popular support, and strategic thinking that was rare among world leaders of any age. More importantly, he was addressing genuine African grievances about economic exploitation that resonated across the continent. The evening brought news that would keep Trump awake for another sleepless night. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, announced that it was seriously considering joining the Afro money plan. If successful, this would bring the world's sixth largest oil producer and most populous African nation into Traoré's economic independence movement. The implications of such a development would extend far beyond Africa and could reshape global energy and financial markets. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., jarring Trump from his restless sleep. His secure line was ringing with urgent news from intelligence sources in Lagos, Nigeria. President Bola Tinubu had just concluded a private meeting with Ibrahim Traoré, and preliminary reports suggested that Africa's most populous nation was moving closer to joining the Afro money plan. The implications made Trump's hands tremble as he reached for his coffee. Nigeria's potential participation would transform Traoré's currency initiative from an interesting African experiment into a genuine challenge to global financial order. With over 220 million people, massive oil reserves, and Africa's largest economy, Nigeria's involvement would provide the Afro money plan with credibility and resources that could make it genuinely competitive with established international currencies. Trump's emergency briefing revealed the sophisticated nature of the Nigeria-Burkina Faso discussions. Rather than making hasty political promises, both leaders had assembled teams of economists, oil industry experts, and central banking officials to examine practical implementation strategies. The technical competence displayed in these negotiations surprised American observers who had expected emotional rhetoric rather than detailed economic planning. The oil industry implications were staggering. Nigeria pumped approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil daily, generating revenue that currently flowed through dollar-denominated international markets. If Nigeria began accepting payment for oil exports in the new African currency, it could create immediate international demand for Traoré's monetary system and provide substantial backing for the currency's value. Intelligence reports painted a picture of growing enthusiasm among Nigerian business leaders for greater independence from Western financial systems. Years of currency devaluation, inflation, and complicated international banking relationships had created genuine interest in alternative systems that might provide greater stability and autonomy for African economic decisions. The timing of Nigeria's interest was particularly significant. The country was experiencing renewed economic confidence following successful reforms and growing oil revenues. This provided Nigerian leaders with the political capital and financial resources necessary to consider bold moves toward monetary independence without risking immediate economic crisis. Trump convened another emergency meeting at Mar-a-Lago, this time including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and several energy industry executives. The discussion quickly focused on how Nigerian participation in the Afro money plan could affect global oil markets and American energy security interests. The scenarios presented were concerning. If Nigeria successfully demonstrated that major oil exporters could operate outside dollar-dominated trading systems, it might encourage other energy-producing nations to consider similar moves. Venezuela, Iran, and Russia had already expressed interest in alternatives to dollar-based oil trading, and a successful African example could accelerate these trends. What particularly troubled Trump was the quality of leadership emerging across Africa. Traoré was no longer an isolated revolutionary figure. He was building relationships with established, internationally respected African leaders who brought decades of experience and substantial resources to his independence movement. This combination of youthful vision and experienced statesmanship created a formidable political coalition. The business intelligence was equally concerning. Major international corporations operating in Nigeria were quietly exploring how they might adapt to a new currency system. Rather than opposing the change, many companies were positioning themselves to benefit from African monetary independence by offering services and expertise for the transition process. Chinese involvement added another dimension of complexity to the situation. Beijing had significantly increased its investment in Nigerian infrastructure over recent years, creating economic relationships that could easily accommodate an African currency system. Chinese officials publicly supported the concept of monetary sovereignty and offered technical assistance for implementing alternative payment systems. The European response revealed the broader international implications of Traoré's initiative. French President Emmanuel Macron had personally called several African leaders, expressing concern about the potential impact on existing economic relationships. However, these diplomatic overtures seemed to be having limited effect on African decisions about monetary independence. Trump's team analyzed the psychological aspects of the African independence movement. Traoré had successfully positioned the currency initiative as part of a broader struggle for dignity and self-determination that resonated deeply with African populations. Opinion polls across the continent showed strong popular support for greater economic independence from former colonial powers. The generational divide was particularly evident in Nigeria. Younger Nigerians, frustrated by years of economic challenges and limited opportunities, viewed the Afro money plan as representing hope for a more prosperous future. Social media platforms were filled with enthusiastic discussions about the potential benefits of African monetary independence. Military and security implications also concerned American strategists. Traoré's success in building African unity around economic issues could extend to other areas of cooperation, potentially affecting American military access and intelligence relationships across the continent. African nations working together on monetary policy might also coordinate more effectively on other international issues. The intelligence community provided Trump with detailed assessments of Traoré's personal leadership capabilities. The young African president had demonstrated remarkable political skills, combining revolutionary rhetoric with practical policy implementation, maintaining popular support while building international relationships, and presenting complex economic concepts in ways that ordinary citizens could understand and support. Financial markets were beginning to reflect the growing seriousness of the African currency initiative. Gold prices continued rising as investors anticipated increased demand from the new African monetary system. Currency traders were positioning themselves for potential volatility as more details about implementation became available. American diplomatic efforts to discourage African participation in the currency plan were meeting with limited success. Traditional incentives and pressure tactics seemed ineffective against leaders who were specifically seeking to reduce their dependence on Western approval and support. Some diplomatic initiatives appeared to be backfiring by reinforcing African determination to achieve greater independence. The technology sector presented both challenges and opportunities. While an African currency system might reduce Western influence over African financial infrastructure, American technology companies could potentially benefit by providing systems and services for the new monetary framework. However, Chinese and European competitors were also positioning themselves to capture these emerging opportunities. Trump found himself studying Traoré's biography more carefully, searching for insights into the young leader's motivations and strategies. The former geology professor had demonstrated an unusual combination of intellectual rigor and political instinct that made him difficult to predict or counter using conventional approaches. As dawn broke over Palm Beach, Trump sat in his study, surrounded by briefing papers and intelligence reports, trying to process a situation unlike anything in his extensive business and political experience. A young African revolutionary had managed to build a coalition that challenged fundamental assumptions about global economic relationships, and traditional American responses seemed inadequate for addressing this new reality. The morning news brought additional confirmation that the world was taking Traoré's currency plan seriously. Financial commentators were discussing the potential implications of African monetary independence, while international relations experts debated whether this represented a fundamental shift in global power relationships or simply another failed attempt at African unity that would eventually collapse under practical pressures. The breakthrough moment came during a live television interview that changed everything. Trump was watching from his Mar-a-Lago office as Ibrahim Traoré appeared on CNN International, fielding questions from veteran journalist Christian Amanpour about his Afro money plan. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the world and mark a turning point in global perceptions of African economic capabilities. When Amanpour challenged Traoré about the technical feasibility of his currency plan, expecting the typical political deflection, the young African leader instead pulled out a tablet and began presenting detailed economic projections, implementation timelines, and risk management strategies with the precision of a seasoned investment banker. His presentation was so comprehensive and professional that even Trump's economic advisors stopped their conversations to listen carefully. Traoré calmly explained how the new African currency would be backed by a diversified portfolio of gold, reserves, strategic minerals, oil deposits, and agricultural commodities from participating nations. He outlined inflation control mechanisms, exchange rate stabilization protocols, and international trade settlement procedures with a level of technical sophistication that surprised everyone watching. The young leader's television performance, revealed months of preparation that Western intelligence agencies had somehow missed. Behind his revolutionary rhetoric lay serious economic planning involving teams of African economists, former central bankers, and international financial experts who had been quietly developing implementation strategies for the currency system. What made Trump particularly uncomfortable was Traoré's obvious intelligence and preparation. The African leader answered complex questions about monetary policy, international trade mechanisms, and currency conversion procedures with confidence, an accuracy that demonstrated genuine expertise rather than political theater. The interview's impact was immediate and profound. Financial markets reacted positively to the demonstration of technical competence behind the Afro money plan. International investors began taking the initiative seriously for the first time, with some expressing interest in participating in the development of African financial infrastructure. Intelligence reports reaching Trump revealed that the CNN interview had been strategically planned to address international skepticism about African economic capabilities. Traoré's team had prepared for months, anticipating exactly the types of technical questions that Western journalists and financial experts would ask about the currency plan. The global reaction was unlike anything Trump had witnessed in his decades of following international affairs. European financial institutions began quietly exploring partnership opportunities with African central banks, while Asian governments expressed interest in incorporating the new African currency into their international trade relationships. What troubled Trump most was the growing respect that Traoré was earning from serious international financial figures. Investment bank executives, central banking officials, and currency trading experts were publicly acknowledging the sophistication of the African currency plan and the competence of its implementation team. The psychological impact extended far beyond financial markets. Traoré's television performance had challenged fundamental assumptions about African leadership capabilities and economic sophistication. International media outlets began reassessing their coverage of African affairs, recognizing that they had potentially underestimated the continent's intellectual and technical resources. American corporate leaders operating in Africa were rapidly adjusting their strategies in response to the changing landscape. Rather than opposing the African currency initiative, many companies began exploring how they could benefit from the new economic relationships and financial systems being developed across the continent. The diplomatic implications were equally significant. African nations that had previously maintained cautious relationships with Western powers began expressing more confidence in their ability to pursue independent economic policies. The success of Traoré's international presentation had demonstrated that African leaders could effectively communicate with global audiences and defend their policy decisions on technical grounds. Trump's intelligence briefings revealed that multiple African nations were accelerating their preparations to join the Afro money plan. The combination of technical competence and popular support that Traoré had demonstrated was inspiring confidence among African leaders who had previously been hesitant about challenging established international economic relationships. The technology component of the currency plan was particularly impressive. African nations were developing blockchain-based payment systems that could potentially operate more efficiently than many existing international financial networks. This technological sophistication contradicted Western assumptions about African technical capabilities and suggested that the new currency system might offer genuine advantages over established alternatives. Private communications intercepted by intelligence agencies revealed that Traoré was receiving advice from former World Bank officials, International Monetary Fund economists, and central banking experts who had become disillusioned with existing international financial systems. This brain trust was providing the technical expertise necessary to make the African currency initiative genuinely competitive with established monetary systems. The business community's response was rapidly evolving from skepticism to serious interest. Major international corporations began assigning teams to study the potential implications of African monetary independence and identify opportunities for profitable engagement with the new economic systems being developed. Trump found himself studying transcripts of Traoré's interview repeatedly, searching for weaknesses or inconsistencies that could be exploited to undermine the African leader's credibility. However, The technical accuracy and logical coherence of Traoré's presentation made such attacks difficult without appearing to dismiss legitimate African aspirations for economic independence. The generational implications were becoming increasingly clear. Younger African leaders across the continent were embracing Traoré's vision of monetary independence, while older politicians who had traditionally maintained close relationships with Western powers were being pressured by their populations to support greater economic sovereignty. International academic institutions began organizing conferences and research projects focused on the African Currency Initiative. Universities that had rarely paid serious attention to African economic affairs suddenly found themselves hosting symposiums on monetary independence and continental financial integration. The media narrative was shifting in ways that concerned American foreign policy establishment. Instead of dismissing the African currency plan as unrealistic political theater, international journalists were beginning to explore the genuine potential for African economic independence and the implications for global financial relationships. Financial technology companies from around the world started expressing interest in providing services for the new African monetary system. The potential market represented by over 1 billion African consumers using innovative payment systems created significant business opportunities that were attracting serious international investment interest. As Trump processed the implications of Traoré's television performance, he realized that the young African leader had achieved something remarkable. In less than an hour of international television, he had transformed global perceptions of African economic capabilities and established himself as a serious challenger to existing international financial arrangements. The evening brought confirmation of what Trump had begun to suspect. Traditional American approaches to African affairs were proving inadequate for dealing with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. The young revolutionary combined genuine popular support, technical competence, strategic vision, and international communication skills in ways that made conventional diplomatic pressure potentially counterproductive. For the first time in his career, Trump found himself genuinely impressed by a foreign leader's intellectual capabilities and strategic thinking. The realization that he was facing an adversary of genuine competence and vision left him uncharacteristically quiet as he contemplated the implications of African economic independence for American global influence. 6 months after Ibrahim Traoré's initial announcement, Trump stood on his Mar-a-Lago balcony watching the sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean, holding a newspaper with headlines that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. African gold. Currency launches successfully, read the Wall Street Journal. Nigeria confirms full participation in Afro money plan, declared the Financial Times. The impossible had become reality, and Trump found himself witnessing the birth of a new chapter in global economic history. The launch ceremony in Ouagadougou had been broadcast live to over 200 million viewers across Africa and millions more internationally. 18 African nations participated in the historic moment when the first African gold dinar transactions were processed through the new continental payment system. The technical execution was flawless, the political symbolism was powerful, and the economic implications were profound. Trump's final intelligence briefing on the matter painted a picture of African achievement that contradicted decades of Western assumptions about the continent's capabilities. The new currency system was operating smoothly, international trade settlements were processing efficiently, and participating African nations were experiencing increased confidence in their economic sovereignty and global standing. The numbers were undeniable. Within the first week of operation, the African gold dinar had processed over $50 billion worth of transactions between participating nations. Gold reserves backing the currency exceeded international standards, digital payment systems were functioning reliably, and exchange rates remained stable despite initial market volatility predictions. What impressed even Trump's skeptical advisors was the sophisticated economic management being demonstrated by African central bankers. Inflation control mechanisms were working effectively. Monetary policy coordination between sovereign nations was proceeding smoothly, and international confidence in the new currency was growing steadily among global investors and trading partners. The HFY. International response had evolved dramatically since Traoré's initial announcement. European Union officials were negotiating currency exchange agreements with the African Monetary Union. Chinese trade representatives were establishing bilateral trading relationships using the new African currency, and even some American corporations were exploring business opportunities within the new economic framework. Nigerian participation had provided the credibility and resources that transformed the Afro money plan from an interesting experiment into a genuine alternative to Western-dominated financial systems. Oil transactions denominated in African gold dinars were creating international demand for the currency while demonstrating practical alternatives to dollar-based energy trading. The success had created a ripple effect across the global south. Other regional organizations were studying the African